Summer of 1962. A private party at a mansion in Bel Air. The guest list read like a who's who of American power. Studio executives, politicians, mobsters pretending to be businessmen, and businessmen pretending they didn't know mobsters. Champagne flowed like water. The laughter was loud. The secrets were louder. Marilyn Monroe was there. She was standing by the pool, alone, nursing a glass of champagne she hadn't touched. The most famous woman in the world, surrounded by 300 people and utterly isolated. Her studio had just fired her. The press was calling her crazy. The men who had used her for years were already looking for her replacement. She was a wounded animal in a room full of predators, and the predators had noticed. 3 men approached her that night. They weren't Hollywood types. They were Chicago types, connected men, dangerous men. Men who saw Marilyn Monroe not as a person, but as an asset, a commodity, a problem that could be monetized or eliminated depending on what served their interests. They had a proposal for her, a film project, an independent production outside the studio system, very lucrative, very private. All she had to do was sign some papers and show up when they called. Marilyn knew what this meant. She had been in Hollywood long enough to recognize a trap when she saw one, but she was exhausted. She was desperate. She was running out of options. She was about to say yes. And then Dean Martin appeared. He materialized out of nowhere, drink in hand, that lazy smile on his face, looking like a man who had wandered over by accident. He put his arm around Marilyn's shoulder. He made a joke. He steered her away from the 3 men as smoothly as a dancer leading a partner across the floor. The men watched them go. One of them started to follow. Dean stopped. He turned around. He looked at the man who was following, and something in his face changed. The smile disappeared. The sleepy eyes sharpened. For just a moment, the mask slipped, and what was underneath was not charming at all. He said something, quietly. Just a few words. Nobody else at the party heard what those words were. The man stopped following. He went back to his friends. They had a brief conversation. And then, all 3 of them left the party without saying goodbye to anyone. Marilyn Monroe never heard from them again. What did Dean Martin say? What possible words could make 3 connected mobsters turn around and walk away from the biggest movie star in the world? That question has haunted Hollywood historians for 60 years. This is the story of the night Dean Martin saved Marilyn Monroe from a fate worse than any headline. This is the story of the man who protected the most vulnerable woman in America when nobody else would. This is the untold legacy. To understand why Marilyn Monroe needed protection in the summer of 1962, you have to understand how completely her world had collapsed. 6 months earlier, she had been on top. She had just finished filming The Misfits with Clark Gable. She had renegotiated her contract with Fox for unprecedented money and creative control. She was taking classes at the actor's studio, determined to prove she was more than just a blonde bombshell. She was planning a future that didn't depend on her body or her beauty. And then everything fell apart. It started with Something's Got to Give, a romantic comedy that was supposed to be her triumphant return to Fox. Instead, it became a nightmare. Marilyn was sick, genuinely sick, with a viral infection that left her bedridden for days at a time. But the studio didn't believe her. They thought she was being difficult. They thought she was on drugs. They thought she was crazy. The gossip columns turned vicious. Stories appeared calling her unprofessional, unstable, impossible to work with. The sources were anonymous, but everyone knew they came from the studio. Fox was waging a war against its own star, trying to destroy her reputation so they could break her contract. In June 1962, they fired her. It wasn't a quiet dismissal. It was a public execution. They announced it to the press. They filed a lawsuit against her for $500,000. They made sure everyone in Hollywood knew that Marilyn Monroe was finished, toxic, unemployable. For Marilyn, it was devastating. The industry she had given her life to had just thrown her away like garbage. The men who had profited from her body and her talent for 15 years had decided she was more trouble than she was worth. She retreated to her house in Brentwood. She stopped eating. She stopped sleeping. She started making phone calls at 3 a.m, desperate for human connection, desperate for someone who still believed in her. Most people didn't take those calls. The Hollywood friends who had surrounded her during the good times suddenly had other commitments. The studio executives who had begged for her autograph were now advising their clients to stay away from her. The men who had promised to love her forever were nowhere to be found. But Dean Martin took those calls. Dean and Marilyn had known each other for years. They had crossed paths at parties, at premieres, at the endless carousel of Hollywood events that famous people were required to attend. They weren't lovers. They weren't even close friends in the traditional sense. But there was a connection. Dean saw something in Marilyn that most people missed. Underneath the blonde hair and the breathy voice and the wiggle that had made her famous, he saw a frightened, intelligent woman who was drowning in a world that only valued her surface. He recognized it because he knew something about masks himself. Dean's whole persona, the drunk act, the laziness, the apparent indifference to everything, was a performance, a shield, a way of keeping the world at arm's length so it couldn't hurt him. He had been wearing that mask for so long that most people forgot there was a real person underneath. Marilyn's mask was different, but the purpose was the same. The dumb blonde, the sex kitten, the girl who was always happy, always available, always exactly what men wanted her to be. She had created that character to survive, and now the character was strangling her. Dean understood this without either of them ever having to say it out loud. When Fox fired Marilyn, Dean did something that shocked everyone in Hollywood. He refused to continue the film without her. Something's Got to Give had been designed as a vehicle for both of them. Dean was the male lead, and he had co-star approval written into his contract. When the studio announced they were replacing Marilyn with Lee Remick, Dean made a phone call. No Marilyn, no Dean. 4 words that should have ended his career. Fox threatened to sue him for millions. They threatened to blacklist him. They threatened everything they could think of. Dean didn't blink. He went to his golf course. He played 18 holes. He had lunch. He waited for the studio to realize they were beaten. Without Dean Martin and Marilyn Monroe, Something's Got to Give was worthless. The distributors had pre-sold the film based on those 2 names. No replacements would satisfy them. Fox had no choice. They rehired Marilyn. They dropped the lawsuit. They even gave her a raise. It was the greatest victory of her career, and she owed it entirely to a man who asked for nothing in return. But the studio wasn't the only enemy Marilyn had that summer. There were other forces circling, darker forces. Forces that Dean Martin understood better than almost anyone in Hollywood. The mob had been interested in Marilyn Monroe for years. It wasn't personal, it was business. Marilyn was connected to the most powerful men in America. She had relationships with both Kennedy brothers, with Frank Sinatra, with a network of politicians and power brokers who controlled things that the mob wanted to control. In the world of organized crime, information is currency, and Marilyn Monroe was a vault full of secrets. The Chicago outfit, in particular, had been paying attention. Sam Giancana, the boss, had helped get Kennedy elected through some creative vote counting in Illinois. He expected favors in return. When those favors didn't materialize, when Bobby Kennedy started prosecuting mobsters instead of protecting them, Giancana got angry. He started looking for leverage. He started looking for pressure points. He started looking at Marilyn Monroe. The plan was simple. Get close to Marilyn, earn her trust, record her conversations, photograph her activities, build a file that could be used to blackmail the Kennedys, or at least embarrass them badly enough to make them back off. If Marilyn cooperated, she would be rewarded, money, protection, projects outside the studio system where she could work without interference. If she didn't cooperate, well, there were other options. Options that didn't require her consent. Options that ended with shallow, graves in the desert, or overdoses that looked like accidents. The 3 men at the Bel Air party were Giancana's advance team. They were there to make the initial approach, to assess whether Marilyn could be recruited or whether more aggressive measures would be necessary. They had no idea that Dean Martin was watching. Dean knew these men, not personally, but by type. He had grown up around men like this in Steubenville, Ohio. He had dealt cards in their gambling dens. He had watched them operate for decades in Las Vegas and Hollywood. He recognized the approach, the friendly smiles, the generous offers, the implication that refusing would be unwise. He had seen it 100 times, and he knew exactly where it led. Marilyn didn't have the experience to see through it. She was tired, she was vulnerable, she was looking for anyone who might help her when the whole world had turned its back. Dean couldn't let it happen. He crossed the party with purpose. that lazy walk that covered ground faster than it looked. He arrived just as the conversation was reaching its critical moment, just as Marilyn was about to make a mistake she couldn't take back. The rescue was elegant, a casual arm around her shoulder, a joke that broke the tension, a gentle steering away from danger that looked like nothing more than a friend saying hello. But one of the men didn't take the hint. He followed. This was the moment that would define everything. Dean stopped. He turned. He looked at the man following them, and something in his expression shifted. People who witnessed it said it was like watching a different person appear. The charming entertainer vanished. In his place was something older, harder, more dangerous. The man from Steubenville, the man who had survived poverty and violence and the kind of life that doesn't leave room for softness. Dean spoke quietly. The words were for the mobster's ears only. According to accounts that surfaced years later, pieced together from second-hand sources and deathbed confessions, Dean said something like this: "I know who you work for. I know what you want. And I know people who would be very unhappy if anything happened to this lady. People who make your boss look like a street corner punk. Walk away. Don't come back. Don't call her. Don't send anyone else. If I hear that anyone has bothered her, I will make one phone call, and you will spend the rest of your very short life regretting this moment." The mobster stared at him. He was trying to figure out if Dean was bluffing. He was trying to calculate the odds. He was running through the scenarios in his head. Dean didn't blink, didn't smile, didn't look away. After a long moment, the mobster turned around and walked back to his friends. They left the party 15 minutes later. What leverage did Dean Martin have? What people was he referring to? How could a singer and actor threaten one of the most powerful crime families in America? The answer lies in the complicated web of relationships that defined that era. Dean Martin was connected to everyone. He was Frank Sinatra's best friend, and Sinatra had deep ties to the mob, ties that could be used as conduits or as shields depending on the circumstances. He was close to the Kennedys, who, despite their current war with organized crime, still had the power of the federal government behind them. He was friends with lawyers, judges, politicians, people who could make life very difficult for anyone who crossed them. But more than that, Dean Martin was beloved. Not just famous, not just successful, beloved by audiences, by colleagues, by the press. If anything happened to Dean Martin or to anyone under his protection, there would be consequences, investigations, headlines, the kind of attention that the mob spent fortunes trying to avoid. Harming Marilyn Monroe while she was clearly under Dean's wing would be like attacking a member of his family. It would trigger responses that couldn't be controlled or predicted. The mobsters understood this calculus. They were businessmen above all else. The potential reward of getting close to Marilyn wasn't worth the certain cost of making an enemy of Dean Martin and everyone he was connected to. So, they walked away. And Marilyn Monroe, for a brief moment, was safe. The weeks following the party were the happiest Marilyn had experienced in years. Fox had capitulated. Something's Got to Give was back on track, with a new director she actually liked and a revised script that gave her more to work with. The lawsuit was dropped. Her salary was increased. For the first time in months, she had hope. She gave interviews to Life magazine, looking radiant and confident. She talked about the future. She talked about having children. She talked about proving everyone wrong. Dean checked in on her regularly. Phone calls, casual dinners. Just enough contact to make sure she knew she wasn't alone, but not so much that it became a burden. He understood that Marilyn needed support, not supervision. The mob kept its distance. Whatever Dean had said at that party, whatever calculations had been made, the decision had been reached. Marilyn Monroe was off limits. For a few weeks, it seemed like everything might work out. It seemed like the darkness that had been closing in on Marilyn might finally recede. It seemed like she might have a second act after all. And then came August. On the morning of August 5th, 1962, Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her Brentwood home. The official cause was an overdose of barbiturates. The official ruling was probable suicide. The world mourned the loss of an icon. The conspiracy theories began immediately and have never stopped. Questions about what really happened that night have filled books and documentaries for 6 decades. But one thing is certain, it wasn't the mob. Whatever dark forces ended Marilyn Monroe's life, They weren't the men who had approached her at that party in Bel Air. They had been warned off. They had walked away. They had decided she wasn't worth the trouble. Dean Martin had bought her time. He had given her those final weeks of hope, those interviews where she looked happy, those plans for a future she would never see. He couldn't save her from whatever demons finally caught up with her. But he had saved her from at least one group of predators. When the news broke, Dean was devastated. He didn't talk to the press. He didn't issue statements. He didn't try to make himself part of the story. He just grieved privately for a woman he had tried to protect and couldn't. Something's Got to Give was never finished. The footage that exists shows two people with remarkable chemistry. A leading man looking at his co-star with genuine warmth, and a woman who, for a few moments at least, seemed safe. Dean never talked about what he had done for Marilyn. He never claimed credit for the confrontation at the party, or the stand against the studio. When people asked about her, he would just shake his head and say she was a sweet kid who deserved better than she got. That was Dean Martin, the man who did the right thing and never needed anyone to know about it. The man who protected the vulnerable when it would have been easier to look away. The man who understood that real strength isn't about fighting, it's about standing up when standing up matters. Marilyn Monroe spent her whole life surrounded by people who wanted something from her. Her beauty, her fame, her body, her secrets. Dean Martin wanted nothing. He just wanted her to be okay. In a world full of takers, he was the one who gave. That's why, 60 years later, we're still telling his story. Not because of the songs, although the songs were beautiful. Not because of the movies, although the movies were entertaining. But because in the moments when it mattered, when no one was watching, when there was nothing to gain, Dean Martin showed us what it means to be a man. The king of cool wasn't cool because he didn't care. He was cool because he cared about the right things. And for one brief shining summer, he cared about Marilyn Monroe.